Welcome to a special broadcast on Wisconsin's food manufacturing and processing industry. We have 4 industry leaders, and I'm going to ask each of them to identify themselves. Mark, would you go first, please?
My name is Mark Arthwaite. I'm the Executive Director for the Wisconsin Brewers Guild.
I'm Nick George, President of the Midwest Food Products Association.
My name is John Holyfield. I'm the Director of Government Affairs for the Wisconsin Dairy Business Association.
I'm John Umhafer. I'm Executive Director of the Wisconsin Cheesemakers Association.
We're also joined by 2 leaders of Competitive Wisconsin, a group with a vision of how sectors of Wisconsin's economy can grow and prosper. Please.
Hi, I'm Jim Wood. I am Chairman of Wood Communications Group, and I serve as Strategic Counsel to Competitive Wisconsin and to the BeBoldIII Council.
And I am Mark O'Connell, Executive Director of the Wisconsin Counties Association, and also Vice President of Competitive Wisconsin.
Jim, before we get into some of these specifics, can you give us an overview of how important food processing and manufacturing is to Wisconsin's economy?
Food manufacturing is a critical and essential component of the Wisconsin economy. The cluster employs more than 64,000 people in Wisconsin and generates more than $8 billion for the state's gross domestic product, ranking it 10th in the nation. The cluster has demonstrated strong employment growth over the past decade, and comparative employment numbers suggest that the cluster is sustainable because it holds significant prominence in the nation's food production capacity. Wisconsin, for example, is the top dairy products employer in the nation, employing even more people than California, New York, and Ohio. It ranks 4th in the nation in employing people in the fruit and vegetable preserving specialty foods category, behind only California, Washington, and Oregon. It ranks 12th in animal slaughtering and processing and 8th in other food manufacturing. Equally important, Wisconsin's food manufacturers are major consumers of Wisconsin's agricultural produce and as such play a critical role in supporting and complementing rural economies across the state. So that's the numbers and the pictures and the charts of what the industry looks like here in the state of Wisconsin. But I think it would make some sense if you guys wouldn't mind just take a couple of minutes and talk about who your members are and where they're located around the state and give us some kind of a human feel. You're dealing with these people all the time. John?
So I represent the Dairy Business Association. We have several hundred farmer members. They're spread throughout the state pretty evenly, with probably the highest concentrations in south central, southwest, and in northeastern Wisconsin. We also have a membership for corporate sponsors, these are folks who support our farmers, and those again spread all throughout the state, including even our biggest cities. So really dairy touches almost every area of the state.
And our association has been around since 1905. We started out as the Wisconsin Canners Association. Now our membership is broader than just vegetable processors, but we are dominated by them. And like all processors, they go where the raw product is. So my membership is predominantly central Wisconsin, southern Wisconsin, and over on the western side of the state also.
The association's been around for 125 years this year. Our members are multi-generation families. They are cooperatives. There are some corporate members, and there's about 125 places in Wisconsin where we make cheese. In addition, there is yogurt makers, there's ice cream makers, and what's often not known is that there are as many, about 200 places in Wisconsin where we make cheese vats, we make dairy ingredients. So all told, there's about 500 members in our association who are making dairy products for people in the United States and around the world.
So Wisconsin Brewers Guild was founded in 1997. It's the 4th longest tenured craft brewers trade association in the United States. It would be surprising to a lot of people if they heard that about 35, 40 years ago there were only 7 producing breweries in the state of Wisconsin. We now have approximately 165 and probably another 15 that are coming online within the next year. So we've seen quite a resurgence in brewing activity in the state of Wisconsin. We're a membership of around 100 breweries and an additional 35 to 40 allied trade organizations as well.
Jim, could you give us a little background on what we're about to see and why we have all these experts around the table, please?
You bet, Steve. Thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I appreciate your being here today. Appreciate everybody's being here today. The food manufacturers identified 3 major groupings of issues, okay? Their number one issue is workforce. They don't think they've got the workforce they need. They don't think they've got the numbers they need in terms of potential workers going down the road. The second major issue they identified was concerns about regulatory processes in the state of Wisconsin, and we'll be talking about that. And then the third kind of grouping of issues was concern about infrastructure in the state and the lack of public understanding and awareness of the importance of the industry and some of the issues we were confronting.
Mark, you and I had a chance to interview some of these specific leaders of businesses in food processing and manufacturing. They had some fascinating stories, wouldn't you agree?
You're right, Steve. And one of the things that came out very clearly is that when it comes to regulation of the food creation business in this state, science and practicality or reality, there's an inconsistency. And it's not unusual. Oftentimes, government and regulation, it takes a long time to catch up. But in this case, it's hurting our industry. We're not able to do the kinds of things that we ought to be doing to maintain our top of the world status in the food creation business.
We're talking about rules and regulations with leaders of Wisconsin's food processing industry.
I am Jim Ostrom. I am partner in a business called Milk Source. We are dairy farmers in Wisconsin, Missouri, Kansas, Michigan, and we have a processing business in Pennsylvania.
When the topic rules and regulations, what does it mean to someone in the business like you, sir, just generally?
Well, I look at rules and regulations as something that's important to protect the environment, but I also look at it as how is the posture of the state that's doing the regulating? Is it scientifically based, or is it more religiously based, if I could use that word, and meaning activist based? And so I look for places to invest where I look at it as a fair shake, and that's scientifically based.
Hey, I am the Vice President of Operations Support for Breakbush Brothers in Westfield, Wisconsin. We are a food processor that specializes in preparing fully cooked poultry products, mainly fully cooked poultry products, for the food service industry. Our market is all 50 states, and we have manufacturing facilities in Wisconsin, Minnesota, and Texas.
You're in a field that changes hourly by the minute. So what's the balance between science and technology?
It's huge. I tell you what, science is where we need to get to for our regulatory state here in Wisconsin. It's science that we're trying to defend our solutions to get to the end outcome. Again, I'll use the Wisconsin DNR as a good example. We're expected to utilize science to prove to the DNR that projects that we're coming forward with are going to meet their outcome. I also expect that science to be on the other side, that those outcomes that they're expecting are also based on science. I think here's where the mismatch comes in between science.
Has it become tougher?
I think it has. The regulations themselves were written in the 1970s, and we've got technology just roaring along now to take care of things like phosphorus that end up it's actually from cow's milk that ends up in our wash water, nitrogen, salt. And so those are the big three things we're seeing that we need to regulate. And it's tough. The regulations are changing, and they're not changing as fast as our technology is changing.
Well, paint a picture of the future. If some of these rules and regs issues were solved, how big could the cheese industry in Wisconsin grow in 5-10 years?
It could definitely grow. We do see Wisconsin is often trying to be the leader in following EPA in the area of let's be the most comprehensive in wastewater treatment in the United States. So we're looking at Minnesota, Illinois, Michigan, all around us, big dairying states, and then they have a different playing field, frankly, with their regulators. And it's not that we don't want to comply, it's that the compliance is tougher here in the state, and that's not as flexible to where we are bringing our technology on and they're not acknowledging it.
That we have such an incredible list of assets with our water and our land and our bright people. Those resources are the very lifeblood of the food industry. So the last thing the food industry wants to disaffect are those resources. But are our regulations appropriate to protect those resources?
And I would say that the regulations unfortunately lag technological developments. So you don't have a lot of creativity where, things that Jim in his business are doing are light years ahead of where the regulations are. And yet they're stuck in a regulatory framework that doesn't respond to doing anything innovative or creative or advancing, moving the ball. And that's a problem too.
I see cases of culture of complexity, culture of making it difficult or slow moving to produce a new permit issuance. And I think it's back to the attitude and the approach of the organizations that regulate us, is to be proactive and to be working with industry. And if we can shift that, I don't know how to shift it, but it needs to be shifted. So we in industry are expected to comply with the regulations, but let us comply in the best available technology and the best available science, and shift the culture away from Big Brother holding back permits to Big Brother perhaps making sure we are complying. And I think that would be profound for the state of Wisconsin.
Just to pick up on Jim's point, I think industry would, by and large, largely support a concept where they're allowed to self-direct their future. The rules are clear on the books. There are professionals around them that they can hire to help them comply from an engineering and a compliance standpoint. Let them run. And the agency can be in an enforcement mode to ensure that there is compliance going on. And if there are bad actors, make an example of them, by all means. And I think industry would step up to the plate on that in a big way. And it's this sort of double checking that is a problem. You know, Jim or any of John's members hire very experienced engineering consulting firms that have their professional license on the line, their liability insurance on the line, and yet you have someone at a regulatory agency that is far less experienced in the engineering principles that are at play here, in part because of the turnover that Rusty mentioned, doing a recheck of their work, sometimes adding 3 to 6 months to a project that would be entirely unnecessary, because the professional will do their job. We have to approach it with the trust and the thought that the professional is going to perform to that standard. And if they don't, well, that's their problem, and we're going to then need to work on the compliance enforcement side of things.
Angela?
Yeah, so one thing to add to what Dave was just saying, I had a client who had a new plant manager, and we were going through a simple permit renewal. Nothing really new about the facility, and it was a brand new guy, and he said, why are we having all these meetings? I've operated in New York and California and Virginia. I've done a dozen permits. Why are we going through this? 6 months later, he was like, oh, I understand why we had all those pre-meetings, because DNR, every step of the way, rechecked all of our data, rechecked everything our engineers were saying, and we weren't even doing a plant upgrade. This was a simple renewal. And so I think what Dave was saying, we have a lot of professionals out there who can certify things, who have done this, but we're adding time and cost and burdensome additional checks to our processes, even though people are meeting the standards. We're just double checking everything. And that distrust needs to go away, so that this should have been a simple renewal, and yet it took forever.
Is that time issue, I guess maybe Rusty and Jim, are we recosting Wisconsin jobs with that kind of a time issue?
I really think, I think you really are. I'm going to just build on the time the issue that was both brought up here by David and Angela. What has to happen is the DNR. I'll use them for a fine example. That's my closest tie that I have for a regulatory agency. The inefficiencies that they're running in their operation, first, are exactly what David brought up. Providing them a document, a finished blueprint, a plan, a design that's stamped by a PE that you provide to the DNR, and they have up to 90 days to review that reviewed piece of paper of something that may have been done hundreds of times already. And I'll use the spray field, wastewater treatment and spray field irrigation. There's hundreds of them across the state. Why does the DNR continue to waste their time and energy and that of an engineer down at the DNR, taking up to 90 days, which is a delay for me, so that they can approve what's already been stamped by a PE and has been done 100 times before? That engineer could best be utilized working on the outcomes and the science behind those outcomes to justify what you're both after. The engineer has provided the solution of how we're going to meet that outcome, and the DNR can take it from there. But the inefficiency within the organization doing what we're doing as a private individual time and time and time again, and that's not just one step, it's every step along the way, as Angela pointed out.
Well, as you said, it's a balancing act. You have science, you have technology, and you have the need to protect the environment. Well, you've been watching it for a couple decades. Has Wisconsin's regulatory environment, has it swung to the point where it is hurting our development of food processing and manufacturing?
Well, obviously, I think we can do better. There's no question about it. As I talk to people in the industry, as I talk to scientists and others, you can see where there is dramatic changes taking place, and we need to make sure that we have a structure that can take advantage of the changes that occur and bring to bear the expertise, whether it be in private industry, whether it be in academia, or wherever we may find it.
Gentlemen, you've just seen and heard some real frustrations from our colleagues in the industry. To paraphrase, or I guess to repeat what Representative Barca just said, we can do better. What have you seen?
Well, in our industry, we see more helpful regulation from one department, an agency may be less helpful. And I think if we could get the agencies on par with each other, that would be a start. And as I said earlier, it starts with trust. We need these regulators to understand that we are trying to help the environment. We are trying to keep Wisconsin green and clean and sustainable because our members have been around for 125 years and they're going to be around for another 125 years. So we need the dairy farms in the state to be sustainable as well as the cheesemaker. And they have to believe that we want that we have engineers on staff that have made a career out of cleaning up the wash water from our cheese factories. And we have people that spend their entire lives on food safety issues. So we want to team with the state. We want them to understand that we're their partner, that we're there to join with them to have a clean environment in the state.
Ironically, a lot of the folks that are in the food processing business now, especially on the environmental side, used to work for the DNR. So they came from the DNR, and that's part of their makeup. It's part of their makeup. They care about the environment. So we as businesses are going to try our best to do the right thing when it comes to environmental policy. I don't know how you legislate trust, but somehow we've got to figure out how to promote that.
To piggyback on what John was saying, at least 90% of the product that we make is water. So that the importance of water quality and making sure that we're taking care of our responsibility is very important to us. So it's not a battle against regulations, it's a battle for consistency and a mutual understanding of how important a lot of these regulations are, especially as it applies to water.
Consistency comes down to which regulator are you talking to in which part of the state, and is it a new person that just took the job, or is it someone that you've worked with for 30 years that has come to understand the common sense side, not just the regulation on the page. So we see the issues of turnover at staff at Department of Agriculture, Department of Natural Resources. That's an issue because we're having different interpretations, and we see it regionally. We see different regions in the state at these agencies reacting differently to different regulations. So consistency geographically and consistency among new and old employees are both important to us.
Communication seems like, or lack thereof, is one of the underlying causes of the inconsistency, at least that we encounter. There seems to be a lack of communication not only between the different regulatory agencies and the farmers, but also in between the two agencies or the multiple agencies that are enforcing regulations against us, and even within the agency from top down there's communication issues.
So let me just ask a question as I listened to all that and listened to the interviews that came before. You know, when Deloitte went out to do the comparative research, they went and interviewed food manufacturing executives in New York and Colorado and Texas. And they specifically asked them about the issues that your members had identified as problematic here in the state of Wisconsin, among them regulatory and workforce and infrastructure issues. Not one major executive that Deloitte interviewed in New York, Texas, or Colorado identified permitting and regulatory issues as a big problem for them in their states. But I got to ask, I mean, because the folks we just saw are obviously frustrated, obviously making some pretty tough points. Is that viewpoint representative of your members? And if it is, help me understand what that means for Wisconsin, for those of us who are not food manufacturers, but are taxpayers. Are we losing opportunities here? I mean, what is going on here?
Well, Jim, as you know, businesses love consistency. And when you can't count on when you're going to get your permit, when you can't count on how long it's going to take to get a permit or what you're going to have to do to get one, businesses then look at that as, maybe I'm not going to invest here. Maybe I'll invest someplace else where it's easier to get a permit. That is representative of our members, yes.
People are almost to their breaking point and having tough decisions about whether they'd like to stay and continue farming here or move elsewhere. And these are multi-generational family farms, people who have a tie and a connection to the land at the base that they currently have. And they're still having those discussions and making the choice increasingly to go elsewhere. And it's not as though those 3 other states or our other neighboring states that we compete against, they obviously care about their environment too. They somehow manage to strike a balance in a more effective way than we are right now between regulation and business development.
And of course the cheesemaker relies every day on the milk we get from the dairy farmer. There are no factories without them. And we will too have to follow the milk. And luckily in Wisconsin we've had growth, but our manufacturers know now that sure, there's small cheese plants in the state, and you can build one for a couple $1 million. But to build a significant sized cheese factory in the future in Wisconsin might be a $200 million investment. You're going to choose the state, the place in the United States where you can put that $200 million investment that's going to pay off for the next 50 to 100 years. And so we have to make sure Wisconsin is still that place and the regulations don't chase us away. And what we're all talking about is it's the permit that underlies these factories. And for me, it's size as well. It's regulating someone who's making cheese on a farm and regulating someone who's making cheese in a gigantic factory. And that's where we do see problems where regulation maybe isn't keeping up on both ends of that spectrum. But it comes down to this permit, and it's a permit in our industry for the wash water that comes out of the factory. And the regulation of phosphorus in that wash water and nitrogen and chlorides, trying to keep the water clean in the state. And an example in our industry, not mind-blowing, but still frustrating, was that phosphorus regulations came along in 2010 that were going to cost our industry, according to DNR's own estimate, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of dollars to get a little more phosphorus out of our wash water. Interestingly, the phosphorus comes from cow's milk. We wash our factories down at night, and any milk that's lying in the vat or on the ground washes down the drain, and that phosphorus becomes a problem for regulators. But they came in because of cow's milk. So phosphorus is a natural occurring element, and it's not really a problem until there's too much. So we take out, before regulation, about 99.8% of phosphorus from our wash water. After regulation in 2010, we had to get up to about 99.9. Unfortunately, that tenth of a point, the water's so clean at that point that it is costing industry hundreds of millions of dollars to go to tertiary filtering, a third level of filtering that takes out that last bit. And that's where we talk about, is regulation gone too far? How can we talk about common sense regulation versus regulation that feels that we need perfection, perfect being the enemy of the good? And so that's why we're here today. We're trying to have that conversation with regulators.
So your members have to make decisions to try to grow their industries and thrive, and they have to adjust to the market demands. So do I hear that the rules and regs process is a hindrance to them thriving and growing? Nick?
Yes, I think that you're hearing exactly that. We have a situation similar to what John just talked about, where one of my members gets their water from the municipality. The municipal water has phosphorus levels in it, and my member has to spend money to take that phosphorus out in order to discharge it. Now, somewhere we should be able to figure out how to get around that one. And so far we haven't been able to figure that one out.
So, gentlemen, it seems to me, with what we've seen and heard from some of your colleagues in the industry, and as well as all of us today, this inconsistency or sort of mismatch between science and technology and reality and practicality is a major issue facing the food creation industry in our state. Secondly, we've got a permitting government regulation sort of challenge that you've addressed, I think, very clearly. The BeBold report has looked at these problems, and they've got some recommendations to make. Jim, let's go through some of the recommendations. And what did Deloitte find that they can recommend to our industry in this state?
Under the BeBold process, we convene a strategic planning group of executives from trade associations and corporate executives. And I think we had 4 meetings of that particular group. So they're now processing the Deloitte recommendations and turning them into their own recommendations. So the recommendations that are in the report finally are a hybrid of the Deloitte research and findings and of the opinions that came out of the strategic planning process with the food manufacturers. Then they fall, Mark, as you suggest, into a couple of major categories. One is, I think, both Deloitte in its interviews elsewhere and in the strategic planning process, group process, focused in on this disconnect between what the science and technology can do today and what we are currently doing with it in terms of the regulatory language. And a couple of things I think became apparent, and it was that it's a constantly moving target, that science and technology is changing more quickly today than it's ever changed in the past. The marketplace is changing more quickly than it's ever changed in the past, which means the manufacturing process is changing more quickly than it ever has in the past. And that means you need an environment in which you can train your workforce in a more timely fashion, in which your regulatory requirements are attuned with what the market is doing and with what the technology and the science is. So the question became, for the group as it was looking at, how would you go about doing this? Okay. And ultimately, this is where we got. We said there are 16, 17 private sector employer clusters in the state of Wisconsin. Food manufacturing is one of those, okay? And so suppose we said, well, we think a 4-year cycle would be a good cycle to look at in terms of change of technology and science and whatever. Okay, that's a good idea. And what would that lead us to? Well, it would say once every 4 years, we're going to do a review of the existing regulations and technology in terms of trying to achieve the environmental goals, et cetera, that have been set out and protect the public and all the rest of that. But in order for that to really work, because we want to be partners, as Steve suggested at one point in time in the process, we need to figure out how we approach the regulatory process as more of a problem-solving exercise, a collaboration, if you will, as opposed to competing interests arguing with each other across the table. Our argument would be that we're all on the side of Wisconsin in terms of a healthy economy, a healthy environment, and clearly protecting the public and producing opportunities in this state. So suppose what we did is every 4 years, as you go into this process, and we'll take the food process, is in the first year, you put together a collaboration that includes your members, includes regulatory people, includes legislators, policymakers, academic experts, local government, economic, whatever folks decide needs to be in that collaboration. And in the first year, you say, well, let's take a look at what we've got now in terms of, and let's understand what that looks like in terms of what the technology and the science is today, okay? You work up, you develop your own protocols for how you go about doing that. But your objective is by the end of year 1, you have some specific recommendations that you've identified about what you might do with science and technology. And I think we would want to underscore that this has to be applied technology. It's not conceptual technology that you expect the private sector to chase. It has to be stuff that I can buy and put to work now as opposed to down the road, okay? But that's year 2 then, is we put those tentative preliminary recommendations out there and let people have at them. Let's hear this tug, this back and forth about is this good, bad, or indifferent? Is that good science? Do I really believe that's doable or not? Okay. But by year 3, you're then in a position where you begin to finalize those recommendations, and now you do a feasibility appropriateness assessment of what you're looking at. What would it actually cost? You run some numbers and you say, what's this going to be? How would you enforce this stuff? What sort of thing is going on? And you go into year 4 with an agreed upon bill, essentially, is what it would boil down to. Say, based upon all of this work, this is what we're recommending for changes in the language of the regulatory process. And again, remember that we're looking at the science and the technology. So you may not be changing the measurement standards in terms of water measurement, but you may be changing how you get there and what you could do, and whether you need to get from 98.8 to 99.9 in order to achieve those kinds of objectives. There's one other piece in here that we think is important. The value of this is that now if you're an outsider or a company here and you're trying to say, does this help stabilize the environment? And I'd be interested in your talking about this a little bit. I think this looks more stable. You at least know what kind of a process you're looking at, and you've got a historic record of how you got there. So if you've got a new staffer coming in, they don't get to make it up because the situation is confusing. It's all there. This is what the intent was, et cetera. But in addition, the recommendation is that this process would also identify a panel of experts who would serve for the next 4 years as an appeal panel for any conflict of opinion. Whether if your member was having a trouble with somebody at an agency, you could say, well, I think you're wrong on that. Let's go ask the expert panel. And at least there would be then people who would have the memory, the historic memory of going through this and could comment. That looks a lot more stable to me, and it looks like we are trying to be on top of the best technology, and it looks to me like we're trying to create an environment in which we are problem solvers as opposed to antagonists. So we become protagonists for solving problems. That's the first major one. So why don't we stop there and we'll come back on the other one. But I'd be interested in anything folks want to add. Did I capture that?
When you were talking about how maybe we're hindered from innovation, it is about not just innovating in our products, it's about innovating in how we comply. So maybe this gets at that particular issue. So there's different things we could do that might be a better or more efficient way for us to reach those phosphorus goals, or a more creative way of we're getting into how we might set up a more effective P trading system.
Right.
So we come up with these ideas of what we'd like to reach, but then we don't revisit how we can get there. And technology is changing and might make it easier and more cost effective for us to do it, but we're stuck with our old permit and we're stuck with what the perception was of how we might comply 20 years ago is how we're meant to comply now, even though it's not necessary. So perhaps this system is a way for us to in a periodic way, in a consistent way, continually reevaluate what are our goals and how are we going to get there.
One thing I like about a 4-year system is it recognizes, or should recognize, that there are experts in this field that aren't necessarily at the regulatory agency, that do exist at our factories, but most importantly, there are third-party consultants that are engineers. They do this for a living, and they're liable for their work. They have to do the work right. And to get them involved in a 4-year process, to get them involved in a panel that might review complaints or differences of opinion, I think that's all worthy. And to get them in the permit writing process. Always give the agency the last say in a permit, but let's get these professional engineers that every day build systems that clean up water for farms, for processors. Let's get them in the process, and let's trust that they're there to do a job. And that's the kind of trust, again, I come back to, is there are parties in the state that are willing to help. We can use a process like this, a 4-year review of rules, to give it structure, but let's trust that everyone's there to do a job and that we all want a safe environment.
John, it sounds like what you're talking about is outcome-based regulation. So tell us where you want to get to and allow us to use the latest, greatest advances in science and technology to get to that point. And you're looking for regulators to hold your hand and allow you that flexibility.
Absolutely, and at the same time, let's talk about what is the right number and what is the right number to keep processors in this state. Do we have to spend that last $70 million to get that last 0.1% of a nutrient out of the water? That's part of the discussion too, to let the technology do the job and to let the technology flex, but also to decide what's the right thing both for the economy and the environment in the state. We need to have both of those in a 4-year review so that we don't get regulations changing just because we can. Just because we can find that last tenth doesn't mean it's the best thing we can do for our labor force in this state.
Right. As a Capitol veteran, this 4-year review process, this would take a major change in state law, Jim, wouldn't it?
Yes.
And it would take that, because right now you have the process of legislators empowering agencies to draft rules, and then they review it, and they've been increasingly doing away with some of these old rules and regs. So you are talking about a profound change in state, a pretty significant change in state law, aren't you?
Yes, I mean, there's no question. And I think, quite honestly, again, if you ask yourself what's happening around the world and in this country, this is an era of change. I mean, people who believe that they can nickel and dime their way into surviving in a different economic structure or a different technological structure are falling by the wayside every single day. You know, our workforce, and we'll be talking about that at a different point in this set of programs, we don't have enough workers in this state, and the workforce ultimately then begins to dip. And when the number of workers dips, so does the number of taxes being paid. So it's not just that we don't have enough workers, it is our tax base is eroding. When the tax base erodes, you can't support your schools, you can't support your roads. The conversation we're having here is about how do we keep a healthy industry that has demonstrated capacity for growth nationally and in this state. How do we find a way to keep them here? And I think that is not a conversation that's restricted to food manufacturers. I think you can have the same discussion with other kinds of manufacturers. I think you can have that discussion with people who are trying to hire people to come work in the biosciences category. There are all sorts of conversations. This process, and you're right, we will need major legislative buy-in to get it done. On the other hand, this process can't run wild, okay? I mean, that's the advantage. It goes, you're going to do this, and then you're going to do this, and you have to have these kinds of folks at the table, and you're going to do this. And ultimately, what your goal is to get an agreed-upon bill. And again, I think what I know about change is whatever idea we come up with will change some more as people begin to figure out how to implement it, et cetera. So it's not like we're saying take it or leave it. We're saying this is the path that makes sense to go down. Get us to the point where we can come together to solve problems, to understand problems and solve problems. And let's have a process that enables the public to learn about it, the media to learn about it, the legislators to learn about it, our members to understand it. That's a very different and we think more sustainable regulatory environment.
But it would take unity among our food processors and manufacturers to come to the Capitol and we say this would work better. Do you industry leaders think that unity could be achieved? We would want to make the case for this 4-year review process. Potential unity or potential disagreements?
Oh no, I think unity. We work close together right now, and you know, we have several of our members overlap, and so I think we could definitely work together for something like that.
Jim, in the Competitive Wisconsin report, there's a reference to concierge concept. Yeah. Now, this apparently worked in some of these other 3 states sampled, Texas, Colorado, New York. Mm-hmm. Concierge, my understanding, and correct me if I'm wrong, there would be in some of these state agencies or in state government a concierge who would liaison with some of these companies and industries. Does that mean champion, or would that just mean carry their interests forward to be sure that permits are issued pursuant to certain deadlines and timelines? Explain the concierge concept.
Yeah. Well, my own personal take on it, Steve, is that the choice of the word concierge is a unfortunate choice. It
implies a fixer.
It is, but the purpose is critical. You heard everybody at this table talk a few minutes ago about how rapidly their markets are changing and how rapidly their investment expansion decisions are having to be made. And that at the moment, that's working disadvantageously to us. Now, some of the issues we just talked about are regulatory, and we talked about one way to approach it. The concierge, the so-called concierge system, recognizes all of that rapid change and that the market is changing, and that to ignore that or not be aware of it is to put your domestic industries at some risk in terms of competition and the capacity to move forward, okay? And again, I may get some of these examples wrong, but let's take John's example. Well, you heard some of the folks talking about it. So Breakbush is doing an expansion up in the Westfield area, but they're doing a larger expansion in Texas, okay? And they're doing that partially for workforce reasons, but they're doing it partially because here we have to have the engineers recertified by an engineer at DNR, and that produces delays, which is from these guys' point of view, money. It's also not just money, it is their capacity to compete, because that's where the money is. And so if somebody gets there faster with a better product or a better production line, that's a challenge for you. So the concept of the concierge system is somebody in state government whose job it is to understand that cluster, whether it is food manufacturing or it's IT or it's something else. Their job is to be an expert on the cluster, understand what's happening in the market, understanding what's happening with the technology, understand what's happening with distribution systems, understanding the relationship between your capacity to get product to market and whether or not Wisconsin remains viable, not just next year or next month, but 5 years out, 10 years out, because if you're going to make a $200 million investment, you want to have at least a couple of decades where you can get money back off of that. That's their job. And I think it's not so much a question of is their job to understand or is their job to champion it. I think most folks, not just in this cluster, but in other clusters, would tell you if they had somebody who really understood their industry, understood the cluster, that would be a sufficient champion, because then you would be talking with somebody who understood the challenges that you and your members were grappling with on a regular basis. And so in New York, in Colorado, and in Texas, there are people whose job is not refined to one agency, okay? Their job is to do that. It is to understand and interact with that cluster and become, it may be that it's an educator as opposed to a champion. It is somebody who will then go and spend time with an agency, with regulators, or with permitting people and say, we have a problem here, okay? So let's solve this problem. Once again, let's solve this problem. So let's take this engineering stuff, and we should go to that group that's doing the every 4-year review. And I don't know whether it's a matter of certifying engineers in the state of Wisconsin, but if you're a certified engineer, then you don't need the extra 30 or 60 day whatever. And they got a bond. I mean, there are ways to think differently about how you put this piece together. So the job, I would call them problem solvers as opposed to concierge.
Ombudsman or something? Go ahead.
No, I think that it is, again, I think that we are wide open on this, but I think the most telling piece here is that other states are ahead of us in doing this.
Industry leaders, concept of concierge?
I think it would be valuable to know that the person you're talking to at a regulatory agency understands how your product is actually made. So this is something that, you know, in some instances, the regulators that we have to interface with also have broader responsibilities. They're not really attuned to brewery-specific issues. So that's a lot to put on a public employee whose job is to basically decide your fate in some cases. So a mediating presence I could see being a very useful idea.
Follow up quickly. The 15 brewers that are coming online here in the next year or so, how many state agencies do they have to deal with, Mark? DADCAP, DNR, and not even local governments, but give us an example.
Well, yeah, and then there's the federal agencies, the TTB, DADCAP.
What's TTB?
TTB used to be the ATF, but it's Tax and Trade Bureau.
Thank you.
But that's where you get your federal brewers notice approved. And yeah, so it's DATCAP, it's the TTB at the federal level, it's the DOR, it's DNR, there are municipal licensing obligations, so there's no shortage of inspections that a brewery has to go through.
Well, given that example, the concierge or the ombudsman concept, would this person work then for a state agency, or would they be attached to academic? Any thoughts on that, how it might be effective?
If they don't have enough clout, they will not be able to do their jobs. And so they need to be attached either to a regulatory agency or to something like WEDC or the governor's office.
It's not just clout, that is a tactic, having someone who's here to help. The entire state, from the regulatory community and the governor's office on down, has to believe that is the way we want to go. There are other states in the dairy industry that are actively recruiting dairy farms and dairy plants, actively from the governor himself on down, where the governor will meet with prospective candidates. They will look for land alongside you, and they will hand you permits on the day you decide you're going to build a dairy factory in their state. That isn't just a person, not a concierge, it's an attitude in the state that we want to grow this industry aggressively. Yes, we're going to follow regulations, but we want you in this state. That's what we'd like to see, I think, in food processing and brewing is we are so happy you're here. How can we help you grow? And then you have a concierge.
And your members are not hearing this. We want you to expand and locate in Wisconsin now.
It's a mixed message.
Is there a message?
It's a mixed message
problem
yes,
now?
you hear that. You do hear that from the administration. And there are helpful people in the bureaucracy. But also, we are called dischargers by the Department of Natural Resources. We're not called cheesemakers. There's an implication that there's a new polluter wants to come into the state. And we're not a polluter. We're a cheesemaker that can clean up our water and clean it and keep the air clean and keep the land clean with technology that we should be allowed to find and use every day. It's the attitude underlying. We are not here to cause trouble. We are here to grow the state.
I agree with everything John just said. It's an attitude, and we get mixed messages also. Obviously, the jobs that our members provide are loved in the community and welcomed, but sometimes that message doesn't come through the agencies. And I think that's where maybe a concierge is going to help out, maybe make sure that message gets through.
John, on the concierge concept?
Yeah, so we need the mindset to change, but maybe this person or this functionality that the person brings can help in changing the mindset. Because without that mindset changing, we're gonna be in problems. We're gonna have problems.
What we've heard today is that we've got a vibrant industry in this state, poised and desiring to grow even further. But one of the things that industry needs, your industry, the food creation industry needs, is a partner when it comes to regulation, a partner when it comes to permitting, a partner when it comes to solving problems and navigating the regulatory landscape. The Competitive Wisconsin Be Bold report on food creation addresses those issues. The recommendations in that report address those issues. And if we are able to effectuate those recommendations, one piece that is holding us back in the food creation industry can get addressed.
I'm going to wrap it up this way. Competitive Wisconsin identified 3 issues: regulatory reform, workforce issues, and infrastructure. I'd be interested in a quick poll. Where would you rank regulatory reform of those 3? Mark?
Certainly number 1.
Number 1, thank you. Nick?
Number 1.
John?
Right up there with workforce issues.
And John?
Number 1.
It remains a big issue. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.